Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. Today we're bringing you another episode about the subject of language. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on the kind of language we use for third-party exploiters. Most people call them pimps. The pros and cons of different terms. We'll once again be going over euphemisms that a lot of the media likes to use that act as political tools as well, and how they do that. And in order to follow us in this episode, there's no need to go back and listen to the other two we've done. One focused on language around the buyers of prostitution, and another one focused on the selling side. But in case you missed them, we want to let you know they're there. Without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, let's move into the terms for the third parties. And third parties, there's the term there already, third party. I think that can be confusing to people. I sometimes use that to try and stay neutral. It kind of only works if I explain it. So third party, I'm usually meaning a brothel owner, an escort agency owner, a prostitution advertising site owner, or a man who in any way profits off of the prostitution of people. That could also be what most people understand to be a pimp. So who's bringing the women to the brothel or bringing them to the escort agency or bringing them to the street. But third party technically would also involve, for example, there are people in Germany, now we're back to dunking on Germany, rightfully so, who make their money by making prostitution-specific products, like extreme high heels, that are only sold in brothels. So we have these traveling salesmen. And to me, that's a third-party profiteer of the sex industry. But if other people hear the word third party, they're like, oh, who do you mean by that? And then I'd have to launch into a presentation. So third party is probably not ideal on this here, like writing a paper and you've defined that term earlier on.
I really try to use that term when I can as well, because I think that there's good ways that it can be helpful to use it. Like whenever you're talking about, a third party profiteer, it's kind of like what you said, like that could be somebody who, drives women to, so-called dates with Johns, right? And so they're profiting in a third party sense, but I try to distinguish them from what I would call third party exploiters. So that would be somebody who is, actively involved in the sexual transaction rather than doing like the accounting or the bookkeeping or things like that. And we do know that there's crossover to that. Obviously, a lot of third-party profiteers are also third-party exploiters. The drivers are the so-called managers, aka pimps and stuff like that. But it goes back to what you said though, Elly, where people just can't really understand that difference, that distinction. It's such a new kind of term to it. And I think when they hear third-party profiteers, they're thinking like third party involvement, like, oh, there's a threesome happening, or, it's kind of taken down to this more basic level where we're like, no, we're trying to contextualize like the understanding of the exchange, or maybe not exchange, sorry, the encounter of what is happening. So yeah, it's a good term, but I think it's hard to make people understand the distinction between third party profiteers and third party exploiters.
And yeah, there's a lot of other terms floating around out there. So the one that the pro-prostitution lobby loves is manager. And when you hear manager, again, we talked about client. I'm picturing a guy in a suit at a desk, like real white-collar job, legitimacy, bureaucracy. In the back is like a cabinet full of files and like books. Or you could imagine the manager of a talent, like a singer or a star. Like that's the other connotation that wafts into my mind with manager. But anyway, it's a skilled job and he's got timetables, or she's got timetables, and they're just organizing employees. I guess you can also be the manager of a store it's everywhere. It's decent, it's normal, and they're like any other manager. Okay, profit oriented, yes, but not beating their employees. There's no association of abuse necessarily with manager. Control maybe, but professional. Like, I'm controlling the business because we want profits. So what comes to your mind, Michelle, when you hear a manager?
Well, I think it's the same, like you say, this polished person or man in a three-piece suit and, all professional and stuff. And so you're managing, whether it's a group of people or a conglomeration of businesses. So it takes me back again to my profession before in banking. And so that's what it conjures up in my mind.
I'm seeing stock footage of like random guys shaking hands.
Stockbroker. Yes.
I kind of feel like the term is sort of synonymous with boss, which is maybe kind of the next one for us to go into, which, like your manager, it's always seen as someone who's your superior, right? If you're the so-called worker, well, the manager is the person that's one step above you, right? On that corporate ladder, if you will. So to me, I see it as somebody who directs direction and control upon people. And I think that that's obviously very especially problematic when what we're talking about is sex, or, what people want to frame as sex, these commercial engagements, if you will, that are sexually based. So yeah, I think it's just, I don't have much to add to that, but I just think it's another whitewashing term. Manager, boss. Another one could be like agent. It's my agent. A lot of women in prostitution will, paint themselves as models. And a lot of times that happens in America, understandably, because women are still criminalized in basically every state virtually in America. So I think like they say like, that's my agent, and it kind of ties into the whole, I'm a model looking for clients, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't like any of them.
Then there's brothel or escort agency operator or owner. And I do find myself using these because they feel fairly neutral, but operator is already kind of professional. And owner has this distanced feel of he's like he owns it, but someone else is doing the management. Owner is almost too hands off because some brothel owners, I do use that for like a better term. I do use that a lot. Some of them do sit back and let other people do the day-to-day, and others are very involved. And that includes when they're very overtly involved in many, many scandals in Germany that have happened, where legal brothel owners have their fingers overtly in the trafficking business. And they're talking to the gangsters, and they know they're gangsters, and they don't care. Or they need those to supply the brothels because poverty isn't enough of a pushing force, so you need the overt violence. So owner is almost too detached to make clear that a lot of these people are very calculated. They know that the women are being traumatized and harmed. And there's these weird TV interviews with German brothel owners, some of whom get later convicted for working directly with organized crime. Not enough of them, but some of them get convicted. Sometimes, I don't know, they want to suggest, like, I really care about my girls. And then other times they're saying, yeah, but it's kind of a tough job. You need to have a good constitution to handle it. And sometimes I see my girls, my ladies are tired and I give them a day off. I don't know.
I think what's interesting and also tricky about this term is that there is a lot of crossover between brothel owners and operators in many contexts. And whether that's in actuality, for many of us who sold sex and thought, hey, I can make it safe, I'm going to open up a brothel and I'll continue selling my sex out of there. Like, that's one route it could go. But then there's also the women who are trafficked or exploited sexually that get put as the owner, but they're not actually the owner. But they're operating the place, but they're not really then technically an owner operator because they're a figurehead. Like, it's so tricky to kind of define a term of somebody who owns and operates a brothel of any spectrum of that because of it being so diverse in how it's constructed. It's hard because, of course, we don't want to label women in prostitution. Like, that's really, I think, what a lot of people, wherever we stand on our ideological footing, I think we all want to destigmatize women in prostitution. And that's hard to do because you also do want to hold the people who operate these facilities accountable. But you don't want to necessarily put a bad term upon a woman who is being exploited, that has been forced into that role or duped into it and thinking that she's actually helping people. And yeah, it's so messy, really, because, you know, here in Canada, or at least in my city, the majority of the brothels are owned by women who continue to be in situations with sex buyers one-on-one directly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
I have a quick question because I'd really like us to explore this. But for me, being exploited and sold by women, they didn't have a place to sell me. They had houses and individuals. So how is that different, would you say, from running a brothel or managing a brothel, but the exploitation is still prevalent?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because nothing really changes. The only thing that has changed typically is that there's a brick and mortar building where, you know, the buyer is going there regularly versus an escort agency where you're sending women to see these guys in hotels or their homes or whatever. Or like you said, they're renting these micro operations. So like renting apartments and using Airbnbs, stuff like that.
Very common in Germany.
Yeah. So I think there isn't really a big difference. I think that the brothel ownership, like I said, is just that brick and mortar and also typically licensed more at a higher frequency than oftentimes escorting is, because escorting, you can work around it. Whereas if you actually create a building or lease a building, typically then you have to have city compliance with zoning and with business licensing. Whereas if you just put a phone number on an internet site somewhere and say, call us, then really who's going to stumble upon that? Somebody might eventually, might get reported to the city licensing department by competition or your enemies or something like that. But it really is no different in my mind. It's just that it becomes more deeply sanctioned and embedded when you have a physical space that is intended strictly for that purpose.
Thank you. I thought that was really important for us to differentiate or speak into.
Yeah. And I think that there's also more stigma placed upon owning a brothel than there is on owning an escort agency, because people still believe, escorting those women are just going out for a nice dinner and this and that. And it's like, listen, most of those women do not want to go out for dinner. So like when people are like, oh, you're so lucky that these men took you out to dinner and took you on trips, it was like, we loathe that. Okay. We didn't want to be in public with these guys. That was actually torturous. I would have rather not have gone out to dinner, and I did it to make the guy feel better, so I didn't care about that meal. That meal tasted disgusting. No matter how much money it cost, it was the shame of being out in public with this guy who was 2-3 times my age, and very clearly it being a prostitution arrangement with people who would stare. And and Michelle, we can talk about that too.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I don't know if we told you, Elly, but both Michelle and I just a few months ago were in Winnipeg. It was actually when the Cassandra Diamond interview happened, and for listeners, you can go back. That's our pilot episode, our very first one, with survivor Cassandra Diamond. But Michelle and I were with Cassandra and a few other people like April Eve, and we were in Winnipeg in basically one of their fanciest hotels. And we're there for this conference about prosecuting the demand for commercial sex encounters. And as we're at this restaurant, Michelle just looks at me and she's like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm seeing what you're seeing. And we look over and in 2 tables beside us is this very young, very, very thin woman in 6-7 inch heels, super small mini skirt, with this guy who I want to say is probably early to mid 50s,
40s, 50s.
Yeah. And it was just so obvious what the exchange was. And it was just like, oh man, like, and people won't look at that as badly because, hey, he's taking her out for dinner. He's just enjoying the company of a beautiful woman. Whereas when you have this building that says, come here to pay to have sex, that gives that more like, ooh, vibe, I think. So we seem to go nicer and kinder on these escort agencies when really it's like what you said, Michelle. It's the exact same thing. What's really any different about it?
Yeah. I know a number of survivors who just struggle with hotels in general. A hotel is a place to like rest or have a vacation. And they're like, no, I'm just having memories, awful, horrific memories. And like you said, looking around, is this happening somewhere? Is it happening to somebody else? And if you see it, you can't do anything about it, probably.
Yeah, like Michelle and I did talk about like, should
we
follow her into the bathroom?
Should we go and rescue her? Kind of thing.
Like something like we sat there being like, what do we do? Like we can't. But that's the thing is like, what can you do, right? Because we were going to be there at that hotel for the next 3 days. We didn't know if they were staying at that hotel, right? So if we go up to her and we're like, hey, you are worth more than any amount of money that this guy's paying you right now. Here's some resources or this or that. One, that's going to make it much more harder for her to dissociate, to endure that guy later. So she's going to be dealing with that in her mind, which, I mean, those things sometimes can be good, right? Those are the seed plantings, but they can also be very traumatic for women who are in that state. So there was that. And then it was also like, are they staying at this hotel? Are we going to run into them? Is she going to tell him what we said about him? Is he going to threaten us? Like, is he going to cause problems for this conference? Like, we just didn't know. Is he going to take it out on her and be violent to her? Like, so we didn't do anything. But that was heartbreaking in itself, too, to see very clear exploitation happening and being like, well, there's nothing we can do. And
there's actually quite a lot of training for hotel staff in Sweden to recognize and act. But I don't know the details of that, so I don't want to speculate. And we might have at some point an interview with Swedish experts, and then they can tell us how they do prevention without harassing any hotel guests who, I guess, there are age gap couples out there. It exists. But like you said, sometimes the signs are quite overt. And if nobody interferes, like we all know that, like the paper that you wrote, Andrea, for many women, you kind of have to hit rock bottom a lot of the time before you can pull yourself or try to pull yourself out, at which point it becomes torturous because you can't dissociate as you could previously. So
yeah, exactly. And there's more to that story too, but I won't go on a long tangent, but basically really quickly, the bathroom, when we actually went into the washroom, do you remember the picture, Michelle? Did you see that picture? Oh, okay, so in Canada, the red dress is very symbolic of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The MMIW movement, the Red Dress Project, Red Dress Photography Project, all those things are very tied to that awareness. And I don't want to name the hotel because we did have a good conversation with them after and they seemed slightly concerned. But when you go into the bathroom, it's got a picture of a man at a sink with his back to what would be the camera or the person looking at the photo. And he's washing his hands in a sink while a woman in a red dress is sitting on a bed looking completely dissociated and sad and, just broken.
This was like bathroom art?
Yes. Yeah. Like you walk in the bathroom and that's what you were looking at. We went up to the counter and after and said, this is Winnipeg. Like this is really the youngest and most growing population of Indigenous people in Canada. Like this is the center point of this issue in many ways. And Winnipeg has done such incredible work through the activists there to raise awareness about MMIW. Yet here is this beautiful, considered international hotel showing a picture of a woman in a red dress, depressed, while it looks like her John or maybe her husband that she fell in love with. Like, we don't know. But some guy is washing up in a bathroom and she's just like, oh, like I'm broken, and has her head in her hands. And so we went up after and we're like, you got to get rid of this picture. Like, and as you're walking to the bathroom, there was all these like sexualized photos of women and stuff. And I mean, it was meant to be like elegant and beautiful, but so I'm thinking like, here's this woman being exploited and she went to the washroom and undoubtedly saw this, and like how much impact does that have on her as well too? And the whole thing was just sad.
Speaking of third parties, we have to say, I mean, there are some hotels that are very obvious, the ones that you can rent by the hour. Okay, sometimes it's a couple who doesn't have a place to go, but I think their majority of their business is prostitution, so they know full well that they're essentially brothel owners. or pimps, if we want to go that far. And then even some of the fancy hotels, they would never officially like, no tolerance, no, we don't endorse this. But you need to wonder how much revenue even the fancy, supposedly clean, above board places, how much money a lot of them are making. Because where the fancy, the wealthier Johns go, they don't want to go to the hourly hotel unless that's their fetish.
Yes.
They want to do it on the, I don't know, satin sheets or whatever you call it. The hotels have their finger in the pie, in the trafficking exploitation pie, and I think some of them are in denial. Some of them kind of know. Some know very overtly. So,
yeah, and they meet the criteria of a third-party profiteer, but then that begs the argument: are they then a third-party exploiter because they're not taking measures, many of them, to actually counter the exploitation that's happening in their rooms, which is their business, so they're really profiting and making a business out of women being sexually exploited.
Yes, absolutely.
Just briefly, I say this and we might talk about it for 20 minutes. There are the terms porn producer or just film director or adult film director. So that's what we would use for the men behind the camera. Although, we all know some of the men who like to be behind the camera also want to be in front of the camera. There's a lot of overlap. And producer and director, you just think Hollywood. So that's not the association that you want. I mean, these are some of the most dangerous and criminal men out there. Listeners should listen to the episode with Dr. Gail Dines and Roxy Roots. So that's a researcher and a porn expert by lived experience talking about the industry and how unbelievably shady and criminal these men are. But they can call themselves producers and directors, so even artists. I can imagine some of them are calling themselves some variation of like artist or a connoisseur again. So,
and they're getting awarded. For their so-called work,
Yes.
Award-winning adult film producer.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yep. Award-winning for exploiting and damaging women. How wonderful. What an award. What an achievement.
I don't know off the top of my head what these awards are for, but I do know there are some that are like categories like, so this is really awful, but like double penetration, those kinds of things, like pretty brutal acts of women. And then I don't know if they have racial categories as well, or if that's gone out of fashion.
They do.
Like if someone is allowed to be politically incorrect to the point of just being overtly hateful, it's the porn industry. So I don't know if there's like a Latina abuse category that wins awards. I mean, I don't know if it's awarded, but it is a porn category. And they might even consider some of that humorous. I'm sure there's like humorous awards. Funniest mishap on set. I can just picture it. I haven't looked into it deeply.
Yeah, the outtakes or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What would be a better term? I obviously hate the term film director or film producer because I don't think pornography is a film. Even if they put the cheesy storyline to it, it's still porn. So porn producer, the producer part is what's problematic. I don't know if so much the word porn is, but like, yeah, what would you say? Like porn film maker or something like that. Like there has to be another term that doesn't tie it to an actual legitimate profession, but talks about the act of what they're doing. And that's the hard part about so much of this stuff is that it piggybacks on professions and uses those labor terms. And that's how people come to accept it. And they don't get that cringe feeling from it. But, what do you say other than porn producer? Because that's really the closest that you can have to the actuality of what it is, at least with the language that we currently have right now.
I can say a whole bunch of bad titles that come to mind, but I don't think that would be acceptable here. But it just turns my stomach, and to know that they're being awarded for the brutality that is inflicted upon women. And I'm not leaving out our men, and I know that that happens to our men and boys, but we also know the level of brutality that is inflicted upon women and girls. It's just astonishing. Imagine, so Elly, here we go again, right? Mental image. So you've just brutalized someone, but hey, I'm being awarded for capturing this brutality or her fear or whatever it was that made him get the award in the first place. And it just doesn't jive.
I think the scary thing is they're also giving a lot of these awards to the women. So she's standing there with the best award for like triple penetration or whatever.
Right.
And that is grooming. Like that is brainwashing. Like that's the love bombing phase of the abuse. Everyone's celebrating you. You're holding this like shiny trophy. Thanks for enduring the abuse. Can you do that again? We really love that. Can you do that again, baby? Like, right? That's how the pimp pornographers talk. There are no ideal terms, but I think I'm usually using pornographer, which we talked about in our first episode, because porne is a class of sexually exploited women in ancient Rome, sexually enslaved women. So it's somebody making images of sexually enslaved women. But then most people don't know that, so that might not be their mental image. Well, we're working on changing people's mental image.
Oh, I was just going to say, and what's interesting, I think, is that, you know, when we talk about children being filmed, being sexually abused, we are starting to shift away from child pornography or even like pornographer, because we recognize obviously that's child sexual abuse material that has been filmed, but we haven't made that jump yet for the adults, which is, you know, so common among all of these topics. It's that distinction of child and adult and consenting and not, and all these rigid lines that are oftentimes blurry that we know. But like, why don't we have some kind of term that says like creator of filmed sexual abuse, or you know, something like
Filmed
that,
rape.
or like
That's exactly it. Yeah,
because that's really what it is. It's sexual abuse material, right? So, but again, that goes back to it being clunky. Like we can't say men and women who film and make commercial products out of sexual abuse material. Like we need a whole new set of language for all of these things.
That's why a lot of the film child sexual exploitation advocates, they just say CSAM, right? Child sexual abuse material. We could say ASAM, adult sexual abuse material.
We could.
But then the downside is of using the acronym, some people don't know what it means, and then we're not saying it. It's almost sanitizing because we're not saying sexual abuse, the words that people don't want to hear.
Yeah, maybe something like recorded sexual abuse material, filmed sexual abuse material, and having that as like an umbrella term, because obviously that can happen to children, adults, anybody.
Yeah. And again, those kids become 18 and they're not suddenly porn stars on the day that they're 18.
Yes. Yeah. I have certainly used that term, Elly, filmed rape, and I firmly believe that that's what it is. And being a child that was filmed, not just filmed, but pictures taken, to me, it's so clear. It's rape, and that child was just filmed. There's no misunderstanding in that term. But I know we have to be politically correct, and we have to use certain terms that don't land us in hot water, right? So again, it's sanitization of language to appease everyone.
Yeah, to make the conversation bearable for most people. Before we move on, I just want to say I try to never ever say porn star. I do sometimes say performer, which I know is not ideal, because she's not faking. It's actually happening to her body, most of it. Some of it's fake, but most of it's actually happening to her. And a lot of it is not performed. She's just enduring. Actually, mostly I say women in porn. But star is the worst thing you can say, because you're implying fame is the norm. You're implying those women are making loads of money. They're in big villas and yachts and all those images. And they're partying with the Hollywood stars. And yes, some of them are. A few of them do. But they're still deeply traumatized. We have so many so-called former porn stars telling us, like big, big, big names, like Jenna Jameson. I don't think Linda, so-called Lovelace, her actual name was, I think, Marciano. She never became rich, but she was famous. So some people might have called her a star. All those women have come out about what the set is actually like. So even if they got the money, that doesn't mean that there wasn't severe harm caused. So I would just say, please don't use star. You're also helping groom women who think, I'll be a star, right? And maybe if I get into porn, then I'll get into Hollywood, because a few small number of women have made that transition. Porn star, that combination of words is the worst possible combination.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, if you have any doubts about the porn industry, Lana Rhoades has done a lot of really good content about that as well too. Like, my heart just hurt listening to some of the stuff that she endured in gonzo pornography. And yeah, just if you listen to any of these actual situations, or you hear about women in porn who have talked about being exploited as minors and then how people kind of led them to where they ended up, it's very obvious that it's not consenting. It's not choice. And even if women say, oh, I do choose this, like, the conditions also on which these things happen are just horrible. Like, there's no big money. Like, people, when they hear this, they think, oh, that woman probably made like $10,000 to make that scene. Back in the day when porn was like really thriving in Silicon Valley and pre OnlyFans days and all that kind of stuff, where there was actual like a really exclusive porn industry, you know, scenes were running about like anywhere between like 500 and 2,000 for a scene. And for many women, that was hours on set of them being brutalized by oftentimes multiple men in like these gangbang settings and double penetrations, like what you talked about, Elly, and all that kind of stuff. So they're not getting rich. It's like what you said, like that's a pittance, really. And when you look at it, if they're on a set for 6-7 hours and they've made $1,000, like arguably if they had some good post-secondary education and some job opportunities, they could probably make something at least close to that in a conventional job and not have all the trauma and all the injuries and the stigma attached to them later too, when people see those films that are forever immortalized.
So moving on, Michelle, what do you think about the term pimp?
Well, I think we live in a pimp culture where that term is glorified, and I really do believe it's tied to commercial sexual exploitation. It makes me think of the MTV show Pimp My Ride, where they had all these fancy cars with, I think, painted flames, and they had leather massage seats, I think. I think a pimp's primary existence, obviously, is pimping. And I think that's how they live. Many pimps have said, you know, they sold drugs or stole, robbed, whatever came up at the moment and whatever got them money. They refer to women as bitches.
Yeah.
And we are their bitches. So we're there to be exploited, sold, to basically bring money for them. That's their primary goal.
What bothers me about pimps, and this is not really a language thing, I just want to say this because it just makes me mad, is that people make it sound like women need pimps, as if a woman can't literally find a sex buyer on her own with very little effort, if that's the intention or the desperate need that she has to do, right? There's that one that, you know, they think that these people are therefore managers and, oh, he makes connections for me and he knows people and this and that. Like, literally, you can walk down the street in heels and you're going to have men coming up and harassing you that you could have commercial sex with, quote unquote sex, right? And then the second one is that pimps protect women. And that's a lie as well, too, right? Because we know that they are part of the problem. And like you said, Michelle, they see them as like property, like you are my bitch, I own you. And there's branding that happens by these guys.
Chattel.
Tattooing, like all that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, it's kind of going off on a side tangent, but I just wanted to add that it just makes me mad because we don't need them.
Exactly. But here's the thing. There's actual studies that shows that many pimps were introduced to the industry during childhood. And we know about our famous Preston gang out in Nova Scotia, Andrea. And, you know, this is a community. And this is where, you know, their youngsters are groomed to become pimps. They're groomed to become abusers, exploiters. So this is a gang mentality. But it's just really interesting how there are studies that have shown that pimps would say, oh, you know, my mom was a prostitute or my auntie or my grandma was. So therefore, I'm protecting. They have this protection mentality, or that's what they project. But obviously, we know that that's not true because they can be very brutal in the way they operate. And I believe that they see themselves as businessmen. And I've actually heard some of them refer to themselves as businessmen. It's a business, you know, selling women. It's a business. It almost seems, again, it's that acceptability, right? So if you turn it into a business, well, then society says, well,
you're
it's
just a manager.
It's just, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the term like pimp, it doesn't uphold sex work ideology. And I think that that's why they're trying to get away from that, because that word does, for the average person, give you that visceral reaction. It's very clear what it is. And so the pro-sex work lobby obviously doesn't like that term pimp, because that's the one that really, truly, actually, I think somehow on its own names what is actually happening. Like, it's a sour term just on its own. It's heavy on its own. It tells you what it's all about. And I think that that's why we do have that big push for manager, boss, booking agent, operator, owner, all those types of terms, because pimp is just one that they cannot work around. They can't sanitize that in any kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Today, many of the pimps won't admit that they're actual pimps. And so I find that really interesting.
It's like a cool term, but it's a bit gangster. Yeah. And the men who want to have the suit image, not the gangster image, they won't use pimp.
No, they're businessmen.
And so I will admit I use the term pimp because people just understand what I mean. It's another one of these terms that I have qualms with, but people know what it means. And it does have some negative connotations. It's not for polite society. It's like on the edge, that term. But I just looked up where the German word for pimp comes from. And the German word is Zuhälter, which literally would translate to like holding someone to something. So in my mental connotation is a man who's holding a woman's arms, who's like literally like physically pushing her. But that's just my mental image. And the etymology is actually referring to somebody who is having an extramarital affair with a woman. So her lover, outside of marriage, he's her Zuhälter. He's holding her. I didn't know that. I just found that out. Just as we were talking, I was like, I need to know where it comes from. And then it also says, as a synonym for Zuhälter, it says that in Swiss German, there is a term that I've never heard of called Mädchenhirt, which means girl shepherd. So shepherd of girls. And now we're back to the stable, and the girls are sheep or cattle or cows. Okay, I would never use girl shepherd or shepherd of girls. Never. Oh my God. For many reasons. But I do use Zuhälter, just like pimp, because people know what it means. And if you called somebody on the street a Zuhälter, they would be insulted. It is not a nice word. It is, again, like for the gangster rappers, not the guy on the street. So that's a little more from the German context. What do you both think about the terms lover boy pimp? Or I'm hearing Romeo pimp.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the boyfriend. The Romeo pimp who pretends that he's the boyfriend and he starts grooming usually a young girl out of school. Oh, it's my boyfriend. So the girl becomes desensitized to what is happening. And then that allows the man or the older boy in some cases to just manipulate her. And that is where he gets her to fall in love, be dependent upon him, see him in many ways as her savior, knight in shining armor. And he plays on every vulnerability that young girl could possibly have. And that just ultimately leads into exploitation.
When abolitionists, so people who want to fight sexual exploitation, they also, I might have used it as well in the past, say lover boy pimp or Romeo pimp, like in material trying to raise awareness is saying, have you heard of the lover boys? How do you feel about that? Like, I know some people feel like that's almost too nice a word, but it's just gotten established now.
I'm with you. I use it to bring awareness, and I've certainly used it in my material, in research and in briefs. I think it allows young people or youths to understand how this can happen to them. And I think it's important for us to use that kind of language because that is what they can relate to. So when they look at the guy that picks them up at the mall or the guy at school, if they're in primary school, and then you have a high school guy that's showing attention, giving them attention, they need to make this relatable so that they can understand what is exactly happening to them.
When this episode goes out, we'll have a different episode that's gone out before about Andrew Tate, which is like the exemplary Romeo pimp of our times, teaching young men and boys, asking them for money. So they're paying him to teach them how to do this horrific form of exploitation. Like, it's just one of the worst, deepest injuries of breaking someone's trust. I mean, we know mostly male on female intimate partner violence is a huge issue, but manipulating the female partner into prostitution is a vastly underestimated phenomenon. And those are some of the hardest women to reach because they're in love and they think this is love. So yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about that more in depth in other episodes. I was going to lead us over to the terms for the female pimps or third parties, so whatever you want to call them specifically. And one of the biggest ones is madam. And I would ask the English native speakers, what is a madam outside of prostitution? Isn't that like just a fancy honorific, almost like ma'am? Isn't ma'am and madam? Aren't those?
Yes, it can be used that way. Yeah,
like a grand dame, like a grand lady.
I think it's a formal way of saying like miss or missus. It's like, hello, madame, can I pull out your seat for you? Like it's more chivalrous term of it. Yeah. And I'll say I've been guilty of using this term in the past, only because it was so deeply embedded in my unconscious psyche that I used it. But now I don't like it either. I think it is taking another generic term and trying to not appropriate it. Maybe that's not the right word, but it's taking this term, which really should have nothing to do with prostitution, and is trying to make it a prostitution term. And it's just always sad to see terms lost to that industry, like we were saying, client and manager and stuff like that.
Yes. And I'm just seeing a woman in an evening dress with one of these fancy long cigarettes to me. Like that's my mental image. Madame is, again, I'm thinking fancy, wealthy, high society. Yes. Which I'm sure some of those women would want to view themselves that way. And we do know a lot of them are formerly sexually exploited themselves.
I just Googled madam, and it says used to address or refer to a woman in a polite or respectful way. It's also used as a formal acknowledgement during things like business letters, like dearest madam.
Sir and madam, right.
But it's very formal, very official.
Yeah. And like it says, it's a respectful. It's taking terms that are considered kind and respectful and putting that to unsavory actions.
And there's another set of terms for a female third party specifically, which revolve around the term mother. So in Asian massage parlors, the madam is often called mama-san, which is Japanese, and it's just a polite way to refer to your mother. And in Germany, we say Puffmutter. Puff is the way to say brothel, and Mutter just means mother. So the brothel mother.
And that has a very like protection, safeguarding, female solidarity vibe to it. I think it can trick women into thinking, and just like many of us did, that, hey, if I'm operating out of a female-owned and female-operated brothel, I'll be cared for more than I would if it was a male, which, you know, oftentimes is true, but not always, right? So, but it gives that false illusion.
And a lot of the time, the madam or mama-san, she's beholden to a male pimp who's higher up, and she's just a front-facing person. So what are the terms that we'd like to use that we feel are appropriate, but again, not always understood by people? So I'm thinking terms like exploiter and trafficker or trader in women. Those are the kinds of terms I'd like to use, but I don't always, because again, it's like exploiter. Well, that could mean a lot of things and describe a lot of different situations, a lot of different people. It's not as clear, but where I'd like to arrive culturally is that we could say like, again, clunky would be an exploiter of women in brothels, but that's what I would like to say. But in day-to-day practice, hard to implement.
Yeah, and this is all very progressive language too. I think the world forgets that we've only had equality model legislation for 25 years on the global stage since Sweden brought it in 1999, that the language that we're commonly referencing and using is archaic, really. And if it's not archaic and deeply interwoven into society, then it's very, very new based on sex work ideology, but is mass pushed upon society. So very quickly embedding into that social fabric. So what we're talking about is progressive language that people just have not really warmed up to yet.
Yeah. So I want to mention one term that comes from French, and that is, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, prostituteur. So a prostituter. That kind of connects to the term prostituted women. Who is doing the prostituting? It's not she herself by her lonesome. There's someone else who's profiting, and that is the prostituteur, prostituteur. And I would be curious if any French speakers are listening, if that's caught on in any way. The equality model in France is much younger than the Swedish one, so probably in the wider public it hasn't. I think it's a different, I know how to spell it, don't know how to pronounce those French words. Some word with like it's spelled like proxentes or something. That's, I think, the one they usually use for the pimps or the exploiters. But this was an attempt of abolitionists to say, hey, the act of prostituting's not her, it's him. So let's call him a prostituter.
So it's a term for the buyer?
I think it's for the third-party exploiter, the pimp. But,
Sorry. Okay.
But I think it may also sometimes be used for the buyer to try and express how the demand is the reason that the industry exists. But we're already kind of confused. So like prostituter could mean either the buyer or the pimp. So that's why I haven't adopted it, because I'm like, there's several people who could use that label.
Yeah, it kind of does sound like a term for the woman. She's a prostituter, like that's what she does kind of thing. It gave me that vibe as soon as I heard it. But I took 9 years of French in school and I retained absolutely nothing. So I unfortunately don't have any insights on that. But yeah, whenever I heard it, that was the initial vibe that I got, was that it was a term putting the onus on the woman, talking about the actions of her.
Like it's too close to prostitute.
Yeah, I kind of had that vibe.
If you
to
say
it
it fast, then it sounds like prostitute. You're right. One more term about the buyers. This is one of my favorite terms. There's not a lot of favorite words here, but that is the normal colloquial term to refer to a man who pays for prostitution in Sweden. And it's called torsk. And that literally means codfish. That's kind of an ugly fish. And I did ask Merli Asbogard, who's one of our hosts, and she said, yeah, it's derogatory. It's not cute. It's not neutral. They're like slippery and stinky, and we're using it with a derogatory connotation. I'm like, wow, okay, we have more work to do, but Sweden has come up with a slur for men who pay for prostitution without being like really extremely violent in the language or anything. Like, we don't want to be like patriarchal slurs where we completely dehumanize something, but we do put somebody down for this behavior as they should be. It should be stigmatized. But I don't know. Andrea, you're making a skeptical face, or is that just a tired face?
No, I was just thinking, I'm just like, oh, interesting. Like, I just wonder how it came about that it was a codfish, you know? And I'm thinking of like, sadly, a lot of men will say she was a dead lay, she was a cold fish, is sometimes a term that they'll use for women who are not appearingly enthusiastic about their abuse. Yeah, like that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's just interesting. I don't know if there's any link to that, but like that's the only time that I've ever heard a fish brought in as an analogy or term for anything sex related. Was always something derogatory of men saying of women. So it's just interesting to me to hear a codfish being a guy, but maybe that's
let's turn it around.
Is that like they're not romancers, they're not good lovers, they're just codfish. They're men that you tolerate and they're slippery and nasty and you want to throw them back after.
So to finish our episode, and this turned into a 3-part series because there was so much to say, we want to do what we did in the first episode, which is bring you a few sentences with weird euphemistic language and rewrite them. And just to showcase how the mental image of what's going on will change completely depending on the choice of words. So, Andrea, do you want to start?
Yeah, mine's a little bit weird. Before we hit record, we were kind of talking about if it's even a fit. I think it is whenever you hear kind of the background of the whole thing and then you hear the title of this article. So the article I'm going to reference is from SaltWire, and it was published July 6, 2023. So basically 1 year ago from when we're recording now. And the article is talking about what is believed to be Canada's first case involving the enforceability of a contract for so-called sexual services. So the title of the article is HRM Sex Worker Wins Case Against Client Who Wouldn't Pay for Services. So on the surface level, obviously it's already kind of annoying because it says sex worker and client. But then whenever you actually hear like the nature of this services or exchange that they're talking about, it really kind of shows you that really this isn't a labor issue, in my opinion. So I'll kind of give you some background of it. Michelle, you had mentioned Halifax and the North Preston's Finest, the gang out there and everything. So this is actually from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which we know is one of the major trafficking hubs in Canada. Big problem there, very close to the Great Lakes and stuff. So there was a man in Halifax named Bradley Samuelson, and he called up a woman in prostitution and had her arrive at 2:30 in the morning to his location. And they had agreed on her being paid $300 for 1 hour and her transportation covered. So like her cab or her Uber ride. So this woman arrives to this man's location at 2:30 in the morning, ends up staying for 7 hours with him. And at the end, he gave her a bank card and said, okay, go to the bank and get the money out, which, first of all, that's terrible. She shouldn't have to do that. He should have been prepared. Why is he sending her to go get her own payment? Needless to say, and as I'm sure the listeners are readying to hear, the card didn't work. So then this woman rightly is calling up this guy and messaging him and saying, WTF, like, where's the rest of my money? I ended up staying with you for 7 hours. So that's $300 times 7, $2,100. That he did pay her $300 through PayPal, but that wasn't until 3 hours after she left the hotel room. So he only actually paid her for 1 hour. So I don't know, when going back to these like negotiation stages, if she had only agreed to 1 hour and then she got there and then he probably did what many Johns do, just stay longer, I'll pay, and then gave her this card, which didn't work. So it sounds like either way, whether he had her there for 1 hour or 7 hours as his intent, he didn't at any point intend to pay her because he gave her a card that didn't work. She did go to the police. And again, this was last year. So Canada has Nordic model legislation, which criminalizes the buying of sex and makes exempt from prosecution the selling of sex. So when people say, well, you know, these types of things, women can't report to police when they're not paid or any of this kind of stuff, if there's criminalization of men, that's a lie. She did go to the police. She was not charged in any way, rightly so. And this ended up going to court. And so thankfully, the judge ordered that this man pay the woman the remaining $1,800.
Yeah.
So she did thankfully get paid in full for the time that she was stuck with this guy who is very clearly, in my opinion, not meeting the criteria of a client, not worthy of being labeled and described as such, but rather he is, again, in my mind, a sex offender or a sex predator, sex exploiter, someone who has then accessed the commercial sex industry to find a victim. You know, whenever you go back to reading HRM sex worker wins case against client who wouldn't pay for services, how much more can you sanitize the fact that this guy in the middle of the night, 2:30 in the morning, probably high on some kind of drugs,
Yeah.
you know, lured this woman in. I mean, people can argue agency or whatever, but I would say lured her in, duped her under the promise of money, which he had no intention to give her, had to go to court. Her name is now public in media. I'm sure, you know, she received probably a ton of abuse for that. I can't speak on her behalf, but I'm willing to assume that she probably incurred a lot of trauma and re-victimization by having to fight an abuser to pay her for the abuse that she endured with him for 7 hours.
Yeah.
You know, and here we have media basically saying she's a sex worker, he's a client, and this was a service. Where do we draw these lines on what is very clear abuse of somebody based on their vulnerability and their plight in life and deception and all these things? Like, was this actually a valid contractual agreement? I don't know how it would be reworded. I would maybe say like sexually exploited woman wins case against man who refused to pay her agreed upon funds or something like that, you know, rather than the services client sex worker.
Yeah.
Like, this is very, very clearly a case of exploitation.
So I agree. Like, that title does not do justice to what happened to that woman. Yeah. The one I brought is particularly egregious. And this is something where I so wish this was just a conspiracy that some abolitionists had come up with, but we just see sex work language and client and services just trickling down to the discussion of exploitation of minors. So that's the quote that I have. That's what that is about. Before I read it out, this is from the New Zealand government. New Zealand, who's often held up as an exemplary country, who does such a wonderful job in their prostitution policy. So their law is called the Prostitution Reform Act. And what I'll be reading is from the official government review, so from 2008. And it says, in relation to street-based underage prostitution, the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, so that's a major lobbying group that provides some harm reduction services, does not believe that increased arrests of clients by police are an appropriate solution. The NZPC argue that increased arrests will merely drive young people somewhere less visible and consequently less safe, and will not significantly decrease demand. Mm-hmm. They're saying the same thing that they love to say about the adults. If you interfere too much, it'll move underground, not really defining necessarily what underground means. And that's where it gets really bad. But if we as a community, we can see the brothels and we can see the street exploitation, it won't be quite as bad. The men, because they're not committing a crime, it'll be the kinder, gentler men and the less criminal men. And they're extending that narrative to minors.
Yes.
they're essentially arguing for the partial legalization of paid rape of minors.
Who in their right mind would ever think that it's okay to try to say that men who buy children's bodies for sexual abuse should be given any kind of, leeway and not arrested immediately on site and, punished severely for that? Like, yeah, so many thoughts on things to say, but that would be a long 10-minute tangent. So.
Yeah. I wrote about this on my blog, so I'll link the full, because I reviewed their entire chapter on child exploitation. The whole chapter has a lot of concerning parts about how so-called full decrim has actually made it harder to go after child sexual exploiters. Yes. Just imagine if you replaced underage prostitution with, families beating their children or just any other crime against children. Nobody would say, don't arrest people who beat their kids at the mall because they'll do it at home and they'll do it worse at home. Nobody would say that. But we will say that about commercial child sexual exploitations. And the way I would rephrase it is, it's still concerning, but it becomes more clear why it's concerning if you rephrase it. And that is, in relation to street-based sexual exploitation of minors, the New Zealand's Prostitute Collective does not believe that increased arrests of pedocriminal offenders or child abusers by police are an appropriate solution. The NZPC argue that increased arrests will merely drive the underage victims somewhere less visible and consequently less safe, and will not significantly decrease the abuse.
Delusional.
Absolutely.
It's such a leeching of sex work ideology into off-limits areas of like children and stuff. Like, it's one thing if people want to argue for the sex industry because of it being adults. Like, of course, I know we all disagree on that. We can see that abuse doesn't distinguish between age, and its effects are very similar on both adults and children, with the dissociation and the self-loathing that comes, the shame, all that kind of stuff. But like, if we can't even as a society come together and say, whenever you are going after a child knowingly, that you should be held to some type of justice formality, like it just makes me sad, because it's like these kids are the victims of that, in addition to the women. We already knew that women were being victimized by this, but now we're really opening up the floodgates for kids. And I think why this is happening in many cases is because the sex work lobby knows that most men either don't care about age when they're in that sex buying mode, or there really is no way for them to distinguish who is a minor and who isn't, because a lot of the traffickers and stuff will say that you're 18, unless obviously they're trying to market that person specifically as a child. But I think that there's that fear of it, is like, if we draw any attention to any buyers, it's going to negatively affect us as adult quote unquote sex workers. So therefore they're so willing to throw children into the flames of fire to help their mandate of protecting Johns and decriminalizing their impact and their actions. And it's just so evil. It's very, very opposite of child protection and safeguarding.
And we don't use this logic with any other type of offender, like people who beat children or people who beat adults, like in a familiar setting or any other. Like, we don't say, let's legalize some of it so they don't do the more serious stuff. Like, we all realize if we normalize it as a society, let's say to slap your children rather than beat them with a stick or something, that just lays the groundwork for further escalation. Like, we don't think that holds it back. No, we think it opens the floodgates. You can't legalize some abuse. The worst abuse is not going to stop. You may well make it worse. And I think we would usually argue it makes it worse. Just with prostitution, everyone's like, no, not in this case. In this case, having some of it legal will make it less serious. The logic is not working.
Yeah. It makes me think, honestly, that families are just being destroyed from the lack of knowledge or understanding of the agenda that is so prevalent to just simply desensitize or normalize this pedophilia and child abuse in all its forms. I believe that we have a real fight on our hands, and the onus is on us as survivors, as abolitionists, as knowledge keepers, to just bring that awareness and really dissect some of these laws that are going out in various countries and just simplify it so that, the general public can understand it, because I really believe that there is a lack of understanding.
Yeah.
People will see things and just gloss over it and think initially, oh, that's not nice, but they don't really delve deeply into what is being said or what that message is, how does that impact them or ultimately their families?
Yeah, and I think that relies on that community connection. And it's like what you said initially, like families are being destroyed, like in all contexts, and communities are being destroyed. And we're moving so strongly into this hyper individualized nature of societies that it's like we're living among one another, but we're so disconnected from one another at the same time. And so unless something has really impacted you personally or hit you heavy, in some kind of way, you really don't often care. And that's a sad reality, right? You'll see it and you'll kind of be like, meh, it doesn't affect me. Don't really have an opinion about it. If I do, it's a very minor one, not going to act on it, not going to contribute to the fight. And so I think that's a big problem about this topic specifically, is that people don't come forward because it's so hard to heal and recover from being exploited to just function, let alone come and be an advocate and talk about these things and dive back into them, which for so many women and survivors, it's very re-triggering and all of that. So yeah, we need to get back to the collective consciousness. And I don't know where to start, because everything that is marketed to us now is all about the me instead of the we. Like it's all taken down to that individual level. And until we move beyond that, we're screwed.
Yeah. So the following is a tweet by Decrim Now, a pro-prostitution lobby group based in the UK. And they say, because brothels are illegal in the UK, brothel workers can't report their managers if they're exploiting the workers, because the brothel would be shut down and workers would be left penniless. What do you ladies think about that?
Distortion. That's the first word that comes to my mind about it all. It's trying to say, again, we have to sanction these houses of abuse, because if not, the people within them who were seeing being abused, that they have very neatly termed as workers here, as we expected. All of a sudden that brothel will be shut down and workers will be left penniless. Talk about sensationalized too, like penniless. Like it takes you right down to this mindset of a woman literally being in tattered clothing on the side of a street corner. And sure, like, okay, maybe that's how some women end up, of course, but that is such an extreme visual image that it puts in your mind that it's like, oh my God, that would just be absolutely horrific. So therefore we have to allow these brothels because it's better than nothing for the woman. And I think that that's a common tactic that the pro-prostitution lobby likes to use, is to go to these very extreme ends of talking about the suffering of women to try to justify the abuse of women.
What they're really doing is describing a hostage situation. I mean, like you said, it is a little over the top, as in, are we really saying these women have nothing but a specific brothel? I mean, how is that an autonomous sex worker at that stage? Isn't poverty obviously the pimp right there? If she truly, truly has nowhere else to go, how is this autonomous sex work? This is clearly exploitation. But if we really want to make that case, like we're saying, prostitution is one gigantic hostage situation, and let's negotiate with the hostage taker. So we can get some like water to the hostage or something. We can stop the hostage taker from removing a finger. This is what it conjures up to me. But you want to call the hostage taker a manager. That's what's going on at the same time. And you want to give him legal rights to hold women hostage so that the hostage situation is slightly more endurable for the victim. But let's not call her a victim.
Exactly. Yeah, like where it says, because brothels are illegal, brothel workers can't report their managers if they're exploiting the workers. Well, if they're exploiting the so-called workers, they deserve to be shut down. Why would we want to preserve this? Why would a woman who is being exploited to the point that she wants to report it, why wouldn't she then report it, right? In her best interest, she's probably already at the point of wanting to get out of that situation and report them so that it doesn't happen to other people. So like, this isn't a bad thing. If the so-called worker is saying, I am experiencing exploitation and I'm ready to report, well, then where's there any argument to continue allowing such an establishment to continue? There is none.
Yeah, and who's to say the next guy who takes over doesn't do basically the same thing? So that's what happens in Germany, where brothels are legal. Okay, sometimes, occasionally, the owner is held accountable if there's overt trafficking in his establishment. But a lot of the time, they get off scot-free. But then he's just replaced by some other guy who has the same business connections, which includes a lot of connections to organized crime. Yeah, they think there'll just be a lot of middle-class, upper-middle-class businessmen who will start brothels and who will be decent. We know how much exploitation is happening in blue-collar jobs with Amazon. Like if Bezos opened brothels, I think we'd all be very concerned. What do they think is this good manager? What is coming to their mind? To us, there's no ethical pimping. There's no ethical brothel manager. You're always compromising women's boundaries. You're always overstepping. You're always harming. But no, they're like, everyone's an ethical manager till proven otherwise. And that's how the German law sees it. And it's just crazy what illegal brothel owners get away with. So speaking from a society that has normalized this and is slowly waking up that it's a huge mistake, I'm saying to other countries, don't copy us. Please don't copy us.
And for a movement that talks so strongly about women's agency and women's autonomy and all this kind of stuff, they're also the first ones to defend the people who are infracting on that the most.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
like if you are actually so strongly adamant about protecting women's agency and choice and well-being and all this kind of stuff that you claim to be in your defense of prostitution, well, then really you should be looking at these third-party exploiters / profiteers and recognizing that they are not conducive to that argument that you're trying to put forth in defense of prostitution.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's why we do sometimes use the term pimp lobby. I think we need to be careful with that. We shouldn't throw that around with abandon. Not every individual Twitter account we talk to, which might just be a woman who follows the sex work line because she feels it gives her dignity. Like, I acknowledge that there are women who feel this way. I wouldn't discount that, and they're not pimps. But there definitely is a pimp lobby. There's definitely people making really, really high sums of money. Most of them men. A lot of them highly criminal. This is like all extremely well documented, even in the legal industry. Highly criminal people with rap sheets from here to the moon, who are funding PR and getting these news stories that amount to advertising, free advertising. It is a big problem, and they love the sex work narrative, which is why we're never gonna be team sex work, because those guys are all on that team too.
Mm-hmm. Choose your allies carefully.
Yeah. Final thoughts.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I have anything else to add. I think in like 4 hours of this series of episodes, we've unpacked so much, but there's always more to learn. I know that, I'm sure that there'll be new terms that pop up and
we'll be
things
playing
that we'll
whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
For
It feels
sure.
that way.
Yeah.
We probably haven't seen the worst yet. We think MAP is the worst. Just wait, right? That's not very optimistic of me. We need more torch. We need more slurs for exploiters. One thing that I can note, anecdote from Germany, we have the same slur as in English, son of a whore. We're now saying son of a John. Like, I'm encouraging all people I meet, and I've seen like other people, mostly online, mostly in the abolitionist space, but we're trying to establish son of a John. And I know I can already see the counter argument of like, but just by virtue of being the child of a John, you're not a bad person. But it's still a step up from son of a whore.
Yeah, or son of a bitch.
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah. Whatever happened to son of a gun? Wasn't that
Exactly.
Why did we have to start going into attacking people? Like, couldn't we just?
But isn't son of a gun kind of saying like cool dude?
I don't know. Yeah, that's
what
another
a son of a gun.
episode.
Like, what a daring, dashing. I thought that's a positive term.
Oh, maybe we'll have to write this down and start in episode 4 here at some point.
Making up slurs for awful people. Yeah. Thank you to everyone who stuck with us and actually listened to part 3. So to committing to the series, thank you so much. And please go out there and have conversations about language. Think about your language. You don't have to use our language. Make up your own mind. But hopefully you got a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. I think it was a really good discussion. And like Elly said, it really takes us all countering the language that we're seeing taking over so strongly in society by interjecting in just these everyday conversations where we know that these terms are being used widely and without any critical analysis. So it's, now that you've heard 3 hours, 4 hours, whatever of us talking about this, hopefully you can align with us and challenge people when they say, oh, my buddy went and saw a sex worker. You can say, well, actually your buddy went and paid to use the body of a woman who was marginalized or destitute, right? So there's always little ways that we can plant those seeds. And of course, we don't control language. We're not global language police. Nobody really is. These are cultural entities and phenomena that it really takes all of us together to challenge them to try to course correct that. So thanks for anything that you do in that regard. Makes a difference for women and kids.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your time. And, we would love your feedback, especially from different countries and different slangs that you may use in your culture. So we want this to be educational on both sides. And we really appreciate you being here with us. So thank you so much.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.